Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
I'm always on the lookout for a good deal, which is why I regularly browse government auction sites. Living in rural Iowa with limited mobile service gives me plenty of time to indulge in this usually fruitless hobby. Recently, some properties up for sale caught my attention. The state of Minnesota was selling off lesser-used parks and sections of parkland. One listing stood out, the Minnesota River unit from State Forestry, split into 3 parcels. Intrigued, I requested the terms of sale. When dealing with the government, reading the fine print is essential, and this one had plenty of strings attached. The southernmost parcel was about 70 acres and designated as a historical site, meaning any modifications required extensive approval. The property featured a stripped-down sawmill powered by a diesel donkey engine, a coal-fired railroad yard engine, 2 stack-sided gondolas for hauling lumber, and an old diesel crane mounted on railroad tracks for moving logs from the river and loading finished lumber onto barges. All the exhibits were housed in a massive pole barn, while stone chimneys, ovens, and drying kilns with rail tracks for processing would remain intact. The only modern building on-site was a state-run garage used for road maintenance equipment. It had a propane-heated office with telephone service and electricity, since workers sometimes spent full shifts there. The facility also included a heated restroom with showers. The entire building was zoned for heating, with overhead blowers keeping work areas warm and ensuring snow-clearing equipment engines remained operational through winter. The sale contract came with strict conditions. No new buildings could be constructed without board approval. Logging was prohibited without permission. The land couldn't be subdivided, and insurance was mandatory for all structures. If the property was resold, the state had the first right of refusal. So why would I even consider buying it? First, the price would be low since the restrictions made it unattractive to most buyers. Second, it was already fenced off, making it easy to secure. Third, taxes would be minimal as the land was only suitable for hunting. Most importantly, its location was ideal, just 4 miles by river or 7 miles by road from Duluth. But the biggest draw? I'd have 70 acres of secluded woodland all to myself, with no neighbors in sight. I never would have thought about pursuing the property if not for the fact that the place was to be sold as is. The diesel road and grounds maintenance equipment in the maintenance shop were listed on the document of particulars. I made my living doing mowing and snow removal for Redwood College, just down the road from me to the west. The only hang-up I could see was keeping the insurance paid. I investigated with my local provider, giving them all the property details that I could find. They priced it out by size and function. The garage was 40 by 80 feet and 16 feet to the eaves, while the exhibit barn was 60 by 180 feet and 24 feet to the eaves. It had a center line of poles to hold up the roof. The engines were kept winterized, so no fuel was stored in the hall. There was a blacksmith exhibit at one end of the hall, but from the pictures, it looked as if it had been mothballed for years. With the place being sold into private hands, the risk of industrial accidents and arson dropped dramatically. I was given a quote of $950,000 for the barns and property insurance for fenced-off, unimproved woodlands of $15,000 per year. It would take me $3,800 plus fuel, plus electricity, plus garbage service to operate. I put in a bid of $7,500 and then sat back to watch the fools who couldn't or wouldn't read the contract get themselves into trouble. Hell, I could afford the $7,500 out of my savings, and my monthly disability checks came out to almost $2,200 a month. On bad days, I rode a wheelchair and legally owned a handicapped placard for my pickup truck. I'd been whacked just hard enough with the business end of a bucket loader, not enough to lose my legs, but enough to come close to it in surgery. I was still an AIT in the Army when it happened. I ended up with 2 fake knees out of the deal and really screwed up lower legs. Sitting in the cab of an earth mover, a tractor, a skid loader, or a bobcat was just up my alley. Several more bids were entered, all quite a bit higher than mine, but they were promptly withdrawn after further research. By May 15th, mine was the last one standing. I won the competitive bid for the property. Hot damn. I walked a little taller, and if I could have strutted, I would have thought I still had to get there, though, and before the snow got heavy. That gave me a deadline of well before Thanksgiving. Driving around randomly after work, I passed a dirty Trailmaster camper that had been sitting in someone's backyard for what must have been the 5th time. My back brain knew what I was looking for, even if my front brain was too oblivious to see it. I stopped in front of the house, hobbled to the front door, and rang the bell. A young woman answered. I gave her my best homely grin. "Ma'am, I'd like to buy your camper." I got the damnedest reaction from her. She looked terrified. She backed away from the door with her hands in front of her chest as if to push me away. I put my weight on my crutch handles in my pits and held my hands up. "Easy, lady. Easy. I just thought that you had an old camper you wouldn't mind getting rid of. It's half covered by an old torn tarp, the tires are half flat, and it doesn't look like it's been moved in years." She calmed down a little and invited me in. Over a cup of coffee, we talked. I told her about wanting what amounted to a pre-AB house to sit inside a commercial garage. She gave me the story on the thing. Her parents had bought it well before she was born. They spent every vacation in it, usually down in southern Missouri at Bull Shoals Lake in the Ozarks. She'd been in college when they took a Thanksgiving trip to the Minnesota Dells. The heater had poisoned them. She'd been alone for the past 3 years, totally unfit for dealing with it all. She looked pretty lost, even after getting it off her chest. "All right, let's break it down," I said. "Keep in mind, I'm still after that camper, though. What's your plan from here? Where do you want to be in a year?" "College in Tampa. I've got relatives in town. Do you have a confirmed place to go?" "Yes. I could lease or buy a place near campus if I had to. Their insurance paid off, it's all money in the bank right now. That takes care of the next question. Will you have enough money to live on while in school? So far, it sounds like you've got to sell off here and head south. What's holding you back?" "I don't know. When do you need to be on campus?" "September 2nd. That's not long if you're going to sell the house. Thank God Lansing is just down the road, and there's always a market for housing for grad students that want to live off campus. If it were me, I'd be getting the place cleaned up and selling it furnished to a campus housing broker. It's a decent-sized place to live within 5 miles from campus on a major highway, so winter access won't be a problem. You'll be out from under before you know it and on your way south." I leaned forward. "Sort out what you want to have shipped to you, your favorite furnishings, a bedroom suite. Sort out what you want to take with you in the car, a little bedding and clothing. Then let the brokers clean out what they don't want. They'll want some places furnished, some unfurnished, depending on the market. Now, the real question, you still want to get rid of that old camper? It's either take it along or lose it." She shook her head violently. "I'm not setting foot in that thing again." I asked again, "What do you want for it?" She looked me in the eyes. I could see that she had just crossed the Rubicon. From the look in her eyes, "For $1,000, as is." I goggled. "Is that all? Rather, I should be asking, does it start? And what's the mileage on it?" "You're right. If it starts, for $1,000. If not, $3,000. I blinked, then stuck out my hand. "Sold. Got any keys? Are there any papers on it?" We shook. Then she brought out an old gray-painted sheet steel file box labeled Camper. I opened it to find the original title. It almost qualified as an antique, as it was a 1988 model with a single pullout to expand the living room. "Let me get my truck, and we'll see if we can jump the battery." Oh, it tried. But that diesel was over 2 years old in the tank. It had turned into water, grease, and fertilizer in storage. Nope, it wasn't winterized before being stored. I'd bet the water lines were split from freezing, too. It was going to need new rubber all around and maybe a brake job. I'd get the belts and hoses changed out before taking it too far. And the oil definitely needed replacing. "Fine." She held out her hand. $3,000, as is. I smiled but had to complain. "Cold, woman. Cold deal." We shook on it. She signed the title, gave me the box of paperwork, and we traded receipts. "Do you have an address I can reach you in Florida? I wouldn't want to short you if I find a cash box on board or something. Also, I really want a copy of your parents' death certificates. I'll leave you $100 for the copies. I have a feeling the company might want to pay off rather than be faced with a fatality suit. I've got some research to do before I put my foot in it, though." We exchanged particulars, expecting never to see each other again. I remembered something about the Trailmaster Company paying off a lot of wrongful death settlements a while ago. I wondered if I could tie these deaths to it. Tiny little towns seem to either have bloody idiots for mechanics or bloody geniuses. My tiny little town was called Brayton. Henry at Arn Auto was a member of the latter group. I called them to come and get the camper with a warning about the heater being a killer. My instructions were to make it trustworthy, including the generator. By the time they were done, it cost me another $3,800 to get it out of hock. The parts list was nothing short of amazing. I was about broke for the month when it came back to me. I didn't make anything from the college during the summer. I was living on freezer biscuits, peanut butter, and jelly until my government check came in the second week of August. I bought a roll of drawn copper tubing and a handful of compression fittings. I already had a cutting and flaring tool, so I set about replacing all the split lines. They were easy to test. All I had to do was pump up the pressure at 4 a.m. when nobody was making any noise and listen for the hissing. When I finally got it all sealed, I applied pressure and left it alone for a weekend. When the pressure held for 48 hours, I had a good system. I stripped out all the sheets, blankets, and curtains for a good washing. I borrowed a steam cleaner from the college to treat all the carpets. Pretty soon, it started smelling fit to live in. Lansing, just to the east, offered a legal advocate service. By that time, I had the death certificates in hand. I made an appointment to inquire about a corporate wrongful death suit. The fellow I met with was older. He looked like a retired lawyer just staying active. I was glad to have drawn him out of the pool, as he immediately proved his mettle. After reading my files, he closed his glasses and tapped the files with one finger. "I remember this case," he said. "It was a kind of double indemnity. After the first discovery of culpability, the company refused to issue any recalls. Consequent deaths were judged avoidable, and the court dropped the hammer on them. The dates seemed to match up. Let me do a little research and call you back next week." He took copies of all my paperwork and my phone number. I found it hard to sleep that week, wondering what he'd find. Tuesday morning, I got a call. "Do you want to sue for wrongful death and mismanagement? ITLL cost you $60 for the court costs. I'm in." I recited my bank routing number, account number, and a check number to pay him. I resolved to forget about the whole thing until it was resolved. There was nothing else I could do to influence the matter. After all, I no doubt put the cart before the horse, but I had pretty much moved into that Trailmaster camper. I wired shut the gas feed to the heater so nothing stupid would happen. Just as the hunter's moon lit up the November sky, I received an envelope in the mail. I had put the case so far out of my mind that the return address caught me flat stupid. Then I caught on. I took the mail inside and sat at the kitchen table. Then I carefully opened the envelope. It held a letter and a greenish-colored computer-printed check. It had a multicolored stamp for an endorsement. I braced myself. Then I read the amount. Once, twice, 3 times. I finally got the decimal point in the right place. The check was for $3.1 million. I wondered who was screaming. It was me. I settled down enough to call Lisa. "Karen, Lisa, this is the guy on crutches from Brayton. Remember me?" "Oh, hi. How's it going?" Boy, she sounded a lot better. "Pretty good, actually. Really good. I had a guy sue the Trailmaster Corporation for the wrongful death of your parents and negligence in not notifying owners of a known potentially fatal issue. I've got a lot of money here waiting for you. Keep it." I blinked. "What?" "The family I found down here, we hold most of the voting stock in Evergreen Lumber Company. It isn't worth it to me to come get it. But it's over $1 million. Fine. You earned it. You keep it. Good job bleeding the people responsible. They'll always thank you for that." We talked a bit more as she let me down easy. Then we hung up. Well, crap. I went out to eat that night in celebration. I don't remember much about what I had or how it tasted, though. All I remember were all the plans I made for the next day, and how they flip-flopped like a fresh-caught carp. It all came crystal clear as I lay there in bed. After cleaning up and dressing, I drove into Lansing with the check to get it deposited in the credit union. I was a little early, so I had a light breakfast. Once they opened, I went in. I flat-out signed 40% into an account for the income tax men. Since I wasn't the injured party, I figured that 40% was what was paid out for a lottery winner, so that would do. I talked to the branch manager, who unequivocally stated that any money left with the credit union would be covered as if it were under the blanket of the FDIC. I was damn tempted to say, prove it, but I didn't stir the mud. I took out 2 money orders for $250,000 each, then arranged for both a checking account and a debit card. I didn't want to fold those money orders for fear that I'd break them or something. I'd never seen so much cash in one place before. Jesus. Everything I wanted to keep made it into the camper. I put my pickup on the sales lot and sold the house to the same property broker I suggested Lisa use. A trip to Janesville got the camper to the dealer that had done all its maintenance, according to the paperwork. I drove up and talked to the manager. When he heard that I wanted the heater replaced under warranty because it had already killed 2 people, he wasn't very happy. When I started laying pieces of paper on his desk, including the legal finding of 2 counts of negligent homicide, he caved. It took some of the sting out of it for him when I had the entertainment system upgraded to include new speakers, a Blu-ray player, and a 40 DVD disc changer. I had the mattresses replaced, as well as the driving seat and recliners. He had a much more efficient refrigerator freezer in stock, which I also bought. He pretty much worked the thing over. I got it licensed and insured for Minnesota. Highway 90-52 took me due north to Duluth, where the Hampton Inn became my temporary center of operations. First things first, I hired a car and driver for the day. A visit to the Marathon County Employee Credit Union got those pesky money orders off my hands. Next, I got a local cell phone and a copy of the business yellow pages. Once I was established at my new digs, I knew I'd need to get some essential services turned back on, like electricity and a propane tank filled. Our next stop got me wheels, a low-mileage Ford F-250 diesel. I had the driver follow me to the Minnesota forestry site that had sold off the property. I produced my winning bid paperwork and receipt. I was handed the title and keys to the property. Before going out to it, I got both of us fed at a local burger joint. Then we explored a few back roads until we found a way to the property gate. The lane and gate were partially covered in leaves, pine needles, and cast-off limbs. The gate was made of black-painted pipes, filled with diamond fence mesh, and mounted on a rolling track. My keys did the trick and the gate slid back. About half a mile further down an asphalt road, 2 tall yellow limestone smokestacks came into view. What must have been a sawmill and 2 big pole barns, sitting over 200 yards apart. There was an asphalt parking lot at one end of the shorter building and more paved driveway in front of 4 big garage doors at one side. It was off to one side and down a short lane from the big clearing. That's where I went first. I got out of the car and headed for the office door. It opened easily. The driver followed behind me, curious. It was a pretty generic office setup with a counter, a couple of desks, and 2 smaller offices with doors. A light film of dirt everywhere showed that the place had been idle for at least half a year, probably due to a staffing reduction. I picked up the phone. Silence. I nodded. The light switch did nothing. Again I nodded. It was only to be expected. Without power, the heaters wouldn't work either. The dim light from the windows showed me a doorway out to the service and storage bays. The light shone through slots between the pole barn sheets and holes where some fool had used the building for target practice. Christ, this needed work, and fast. One thing I did spot on the office wall, though, I liked a lot. A laminated, D-sized plot of the county road system. Sitting on one end of the counter was my best find yet, a cable modem. Yippee, the place was wired for internet. We left the place as we found it, except for my pickup truck parked outside the office doors. Then we headed back to the hotel. I picked up the camper, released the driver, and drove back out to the property. I parked in the lee of the garage building. After I turned off the engine, I found that it was quiet as hell. I liked it, seeing as how there was a skiff of snow everywhere. The temperature had to be low enough to freeze water. Hopefully, the water pipes inside had been winterized. I'd find out soon enough. I deployed my little generator to provide power to the camper services and called it home. A cell phone call got the electric account attached to my credit union account. I was promised to have the power restored within 24 hours. The LP gas dealer was even better. He promised to have the tanks filled by that evening. There were 2 of them. It being 2 p.m. already, I thought it pretty ambitious, but who was I to complain? Another call got the phone service turned on, which also got the internet service turned on. I got a 2-day estimate on those. A little snooping inside showed me the heater controls, water heater, electrical panel, and the controls for the big overhead garage doors. I sure wasn't getting those open without power. They were big suckers sized for a tractor trailer. I did a little research with the phone book. I found a local pole barn contractor and gave him a call. He was willing to come out to look at the job of patching the barn, insulating it, and sheathing the interior. That was the end of my business for the day. I cooked dinner, ate, and cleaned up afterward. I felt satisfied enough to have a beer while I thought about whatever might happen next. I made a note to get my insurance issues addressed the next day, and to get some health insurance for myself. I considered getting a propane-fueled generator installed so power outages wouldn't leave me high and dry if a storm took out the lines. I discussed this last issue, along with a couple of other matters, with the contractor when he arrived. I'd like this structure sealed, insulated, and sheathed inside to make it relatively winterproof, I told him. Also, I'd like windows installed against the wall opposite the large doors that would match the windows on one side of my motorhome. And I'd like some ducts and hoses put in to vent my camper's heater, range, and water heater as well. Now, I've recently come into some money, and I've always fancied owning a modular bathing and sauna building. I know that they're available as an almost drop-in unit. I've got plenty of propane available here as well. My last item is a safety issue. I don't believe that the heaters in here are ducted outside, since the building was left unsealed. I don't want the damn things to kill me from CO2 or CO poisoning. I'd like you to investigate and amend things as required. And be sure to look into cooling for the summer as well as heating for the winter in 3 major zones. Be sure that one of the options is a straight high-volume draft fan for the open space. I recalled that I hadn't arranged for solid waste recovery. There was a small brick bay set aside for a dumpster, but nothing was in it. I ordered a covered unit with a bi-weekly service contract. I was happy to see the lights flicker on in the workshop and the office. I quickly cut power to the generator and ran a line to the internal circuits. The temperature in the office quickly came up to shirt-sleeve conditions, as did that of the restroom electric heaters. I had to open the master valve to obtain water service, but that was all. The bathroom looked like it was designed in East Germany's industrial school. I asked the contractor about getting it remodeled when he returned later in the week to schedule a start date for the insulation and window job. He promised to bring me some literature on bathing and sauna units, so I knew he'd be looking me up again. After the contractor left, I settled down with a beer and flipped through the channels on the camper's satellite dish. The game I landed on was so boring that I dropped off about 4 a.m. I woke up, stretched, took a shower, and went to bed for the evening. The next day, I went to the assessment office to see how they had my property listed in their records. The assessor's secretary looked it up for me. It was listed as unimproved forest land. I objected to the classification. Instead, it should have been unimprovable. When the assessor joined the discussion, I brought out my contract. Since I could not change it or profit from it, the land was worse than owning desert property. I argued that it was equivalent to owning title to a hazardous waste site. It took a county board meeting to try my case before my tax rate was rationalized. They had me on the fire rolls and the road maintenance rolls, which I was glad to pay for. I ended up paying roughly $1,500 a year instead of over $12,000. Some folks were grumpy about it, but they were hoist by their own petard. They had written the stringent land use policies into the contract, and it came back to bite them in the ass. Their budget did benefit, though, in their staff reduction by 7 employees, so they couldn't complain too much. What's the old story? Employees are the most expensive asset a corporation owns. Since the contractor's job was an inside, heated project, they tackled my remodeling and HVAC work right away. It promised to give some of his core workers a nice paycheck for Christmas. I paid him to haul in a nice, big chest freezer to sit against the back wall of the garage. The office turned into a nice, wood-paneled living room, and my new modular sauna and bath was great on my knees when they really hurt. For Thanksgiving dinner, I looked through a newspaper to see who was advertising. The prices made my eyes water. As I paid a $50 bill, I wondered how the locals could afford it. I remembered as a kid, going to an all-you-can-eat buffet not far north of Duluth for $4.50 to $6 per person for 4 adults. How the times had changed. I used my phone book to call around to all the butcher shops within 20 miles to see who would do a dry-aged quarter of prime beef, some yearling venison, and smoked pork for me. I did a lot of my grocery shopping at IGA, Independent Grocers of America. Chicken stews got boring. So did roasts made from beef and venison. I knocked together a windbreak porch out of fiberglass panels and 4x4s. It held my Weber grill and a couple of bags of charcoal. That, plus the occasional hit on a pizza parlor, made life a lot brighter. Late in the winter, I paid a guy with a slow-flying plane to make a couple of photographic runs over the property. One in the morning, one in the evening. Once developed and blown up to a decent size, they showed where the fire roads had been cut. I talked to the fire marshal about how wide the access lane should be, and bugged the Forest Preserve Land Use Board to get permission to cut back the growth and pull the stumps to clear those lanes. They thought it was a pretty good idea. While the ground was still hard, I gradually stripped back the cuts. I left the pulled shrubbery and treetops in 4 huge slash piles for deer bedding. After the ground thawed, I hand-cast a few acres of high-protein deer forage seed that I bought from Cabela's. I had an idea on how to get around some of the forestry restrictions. They said I couldn't clear-cut or harvest the trees for profit. I looked at all that land that the sawmill operation had clear-cut for log storage and got an idea. I talked to a guy from the Forest Preserve to come help me document everything with his cameras. Bit by bit, I cut down 8 acres of trees that had been growing unmolested for over 100 years. I trimmed them and stacked the small stuff to one side near one of the big kills. Then I drenched the soil with water and used chains to pull the stumps, which also went into a kiln firebox. I ordered a few drums of diesel fuel for the mill's donkey engine, and used a box full of rotary stones, chucked into an electric drill, to sharpen one of the big rotary sawmill blades. I got the ricks of partially peeled greenwood logs loaded into the kiln. After warning the fire department, I fired it up. A couple of steel pipes, perforated with air holes, helped supply more air to burn everything. After a couple of days, I was out of fuel. After the fire went out, I opened the doors at either end of the kiln to let the residual heat and moisture escape. After a short week, the lumber was cool enough to work with. I loaded the sawmill chute and powered up the repurposed donkey engine. Once I got it running, the forestry department guy started filming. I wore ear muffs and a breathing mask. Sawmills are loud and dirty operations. Make no bones about it. I squared off the logs and cut the largest dimensional lumber that I could. I took the logs from one kiln and stacked the finished lumber on pallets in the other kiln, so I had the wood under protected storage at all times. When I was done, I used the slash to do a final slow heating of the finished product, and had the Forest Preserve District haul away the sawdust for their trail maintenance. A 1-inch thick rotary saw blade makes a lot more sawdust than you'd expect. I talked to an arborist, a nurseryman who specialized in trees. He gave me some suggestions for planting orchards, apples and pears. I gave him the go-ahead to plant 8-foot saplings in a wide grid. Such large starters were expensive as hell, but they had a much better chance of surviving transplant shock or being destroyed by local critters. I felt pretty good about what I'd done so far. I had set up 6 deer bowers and planted some forage. I knew that some of it would come back to bite me. The deer would smell the orchard. I just had to either harvest a few deer or investigate what it would take to set up a wolf or coyote urine dispenser to chase them off. I'd worked with bobcat urine before to keep critters out of a garden. One sniff of that stuff would straighten you right up and make you rethink all your life choices. It was the slow season for farmers, early to mid-July. The fields were ripening, the early hay was ready for cutting, and the vegetable gardens were coming in. The farmers' markets were showing evidence of a bountiful harvest. I was in town, sitting at a diner, savoring a piece of cherry pie made by someone who knew what they were doing. Sipping a cup of coffee, I prepared to head out to the local farmers' market for my weekly lettuce and tomato fix, fresh BLT ingredients. A guy called out to me, "Are you the fella that bought the old sawmill from the DNR?" I motioned him over to the table and folded up the newspaper I'd been giving half my attention to. Yep, been putting some good money into it, too. The state hasn't been tending to it for several years. It shows. Now I had his curiosity up. What you been doing? I sat back with my cup of coffee and put my thoughts in order. So far, I've moved my camper inside the garage and vented it. The garage is insulated and wired now. I had a sauna put in, and the old office has been renovated into my living room. I talked the conservation board into letting me clean up the fire roads. I piled the brush I cut at the ends of the lanes for deer mangers and scattered seed for forage nearby. Hopefully, within the next decade, we'll be seeing some trophy deer coming out of there. I've stripped a few acres near the sawmill, where the logs used to be stacked, and planted a small orchard. Yeah, you could say I've been busy. Damn. You mind showing the place off? I used to play around out there as a kid, about killed myself a few times, too. You found the dump yet? Dump? No. I'd like to see that. If it needs cleaning up, then I'll tackle it. Hell, I'm retired now. I need a few projects to work on. I told him I had yet to visit the farmer's market today. Then the liquor store. Then I was heading back. Mind if I tag along? He asked. Not at all, I said. I didn't know too many people around here. I figured it was about time I socialized some. I picked up a half-dozen ripe tomatoes, a couple of heads of lettuce, some radishes, onions, and potatoes. Down the road a bit, I picked up a couple of cases of beer and a bottle of bourbon. I'd noticed some auction notices in the paper, so I picked up a more current copy to take home. With that big county map on the wall, I could find about any property I wanted to. Roger and I slowly walked around the place. I showed him my new orchard, which was doing pretty well under the arborist's care. The arborist came by once a month to check on everything. Roger showed me an overgrown area that he said was a big pit filled with rock and busted-up timbers, with a little dirt thrown over the top. It wasn't too far from the river. I got the bright idea of digging a channel from the pit to the river and using a high-pressure water hose to flush everything clear. I had a great way to get rid of the buried wood and the brush that was growing, a kiln firebox. Roger and I shook hands, and he left, but only after promising to loan me an old picture album documenting the sawmill in operation. I had a project running around loose in the back of my head. I didn't know whether to stomp it flat or listen to it. I decided to show up at the next monthly DNR meeting to see what they thought of the idea. I spent a few weeks at the computer, typing away, putting my thoughts to paper, costing out my materials over the web. Buying the water pump would be expensive, as would renting the crane to drop in the concrete culvert once I was done flushing out the dump. The garage held a Cat 324 hydraulic excavator and a Ford F550 dump truck with a 12-foot bed and a 9-foot snow blade. I'd used some late winter downtime to clean them up with rotary wire brushes and repaint them. The pickup bed and snow blade needed some attention with a welder to add metal where it had either rusted or been ground away. The dump truck needed a heater core, a radiator, and a couple of pumps, but I got it back into commission. Everything got new batteries, fresh belts, and had their hydraulics flushed. The service log on the excavator showed that the track body had just been rebuilt the year before. It was in excellent shape. Somebody had bought a John Deere 4520 tractor with a rollover bar, hydraulic front loader, and a mower deck. It was almost new, which made me wonder why it was left in the garage when they sold the place. I wanted to rebuild the place to look like it did when it was a working timber operation. I wrote down plans to build a historically correct site office building out of limestone blocks and clay tile roofing. That way, the place wouldn't burn down from embers coming out of the smokestacks. The dock would also have to be rebuilt, where the logs were pulled from the river and the barges loaded. I calculated that I'd need roughly 40 limestone blocks measuring 2 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet or 2 feet by 2 feet by 4 feet, depending on what was available. I'd also need 2 dump trucks full of heavy road gravel for the foundation, to lay the walls, and to floor the porch. The floor, roof, and office counter would be good candidates for the cut lumber I had produced. I was sure I could find an old slate blackboard or 2 for the daily tallies. Potbelly stoves were still available, so I planned to use one for heating. I did a little research online. Since the streets of Duluth were being lit by electricity by 1894, I figured it was within the bounds of reason that the office had electric lighting rather than kerosene lamps. If I couldn't find stone blocks in the old dump, then the office would go up for $50,000. I had no figures yet on the rail line extension. I made up some nice covers for my proposal. I blew up one of Roger's old prints of the operation and had it printed in sepia as a cover sheet. I set up a 4-year schedule until completion. Then I added another year to construct a classroom facility out of native dimensional lumber procured from the open market. At first, they were skeptical, to say the least. But as they read further and I talked my way through it, they began to come around. The idea of building the office to match the original facilities and terminating the rail line as it had been used in its heyday appealed to the historians among them. And cleaning up the old dump made the DNR folks all for it. I think what really clinched it was the chance to dispose of a lot of otherwise unusable material dug out during ditch clearing operations. The final phase, which set up a lecture hall and a live historical demonstration of an operating sawmill once a month for high school and college students, sealed the deal. Their total cost to the county would be fuel, lecturers, and demonstrators, the latter of which I could train. First, the dump had to go. It was an illegal dump and a breeding ground for vermin. The County Historical Society had just been given a fire engine pumper that still worked. They let me use it, but it was up to me to figure out how to operate the thing. A trip to the fire department got me in touch with a couple of retired firemen who were willing to do it for me. I started digging out the channel between the dump and the river. That excavator was the cat's pajamas. I got the concrete culvert ordered, 20 feet long, 14 feet wide, and 20 foot tall. The concrete company floated it down the river to me on a barge within 2 weeks. I got the channel cleared out, and then the flushing operation began. 2 weeks later, the water coming out of the dump was as clear as it was going to get. I managed to seat the culvert with the chain and the excavator before the winter freeze set in. The dump itself was over the size of a football field. I had no idea how deep the thing would turn out to be. I spent a lot of time that winter working with a cheap version of Photoshop to get those old prints copied, blown up, cleaned up, and in presentation quality. I even found a picture of the inside of the office. It featured a 2-hole potbelly stove, with a couple of chairs next to it and a small table. I could just make out the grid scored into the surface in the form of a checkerboard. One window looked out to the sawmill with the mill in the background. It took a lot of work to enhance that little 3x5 photograph. Once the ground froze, the temperature quickly dropped. That winter, it hovered around 0 for 2 weeks near Thanksgiving. Then the wind picked up. Tiny little beads of pellet snow fell for days. It squeaked like crazy when walked on. When it hit 14 below for Christmas and stayed colder than 10 below until mid-January. The TV weather pontificators said it was the area's coldest winter in recorded history. The river froze over, but I sure as hell wasn't going to risk my ass testing if it would support my weight. I turned down the thermostats in the garage building to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit to keep the water lines from freezing. I lived in the mobile home. Its heavy layer of insulation and smaller volume to heat made it a much cozier environment. The sauna was super insulated, so I spent my time between the Trailmaster camper and the sauna. I only did 1 load of laundry per week. I didn't want to fill up the septic tank with too much wash water. Right off the bat, that spring, I ran into an unexpected expense. I bought a big spool of wire rope that I could run in and out with the donkey engine. I had to snag all that busted up wood out of the dump, and I couldn't figure out any way to do it other than a huge 2-jaw clamp on a cable to yank the stuff out. I purchased a used skid steer to pack the old wood into the empty kiln's firebox, while the rest of the burnable debris was packed into the top section. It had saturated over the years and needed some time to dry. Then the DNR made me put ember catchers on the kiln chimneys to keep from starting a forest fire or 6. That was a pricey install. I had to hire a couple of guys to climb the towers and install them. I wasn't fool enough to climb those towers myself with my messed up knees. By midsummer, I had cleared out the first 18 feet of the dump. There was a lot of road building dross. Even more old timber stumps and shattered trunks. The County Road Commission must have been using it as a hidey hole they didn't have to pay for a lot of years. I piled the broken concrete and asphalt near the river, where the timber drag was. It would make great fill for the pier once I got the outer pylons pounded in. I finally got down to the layer used by the old sawmill operation. There were more big blocks of limestone than I cared to count, all thrown haphazardly into the pit. I gradually pulled those giant pavers out, stacked them one high on pallets, and loaded up a drying oven. I actually removed most of the fuel that had been packed inside before for firing it. I just wanted to drive off the moisture in the stone, not glaze or crack it. It was a low and slow operation. I had to jury-rig a blade onto the front of the tractor that extended out some 10 feet so that I could refuel the fire without letting it all go out or cool. I dried those stones over low heat for 2 weeks per batch. After all, they had been submerged and saturated for years. I got the foundation dug for the office. A crew laid down 6 inches of dry sand, the way it was done long ago. Then I started fitting the blocks. They weren't perfectly finished or anything like that. I filled the voids with sand mixed with construction adhesive so that it would at least look right while holding out the weather. I didn't get the roof on before ice in, but I got the walls up and pulled another full load of stone for the oven before I had to shut down for the season. I covered the building with a layer of visqueen, held down with 2x4S and rocks. During the winter, I would bundle up, walk outside with a hot coffee, and admire the thing. It looked like it belonged. I had used the images from the archive to locate and turn it until everything matched before I even thought about cutting that foundation. Come spring, I asked the county for trees and root balls that got pulled out of the ditches. Come on, boys, I thought, lay that firewood on me. I got enough for 3 kiln firings without paying a dime. Not much but pine, birch, cedar, and poplar grows around here. I had to send away for the oak sleepers I'd need to rebuild the rail lines as they had been. I spent more than a few days looking over that old wood and coal-fired yard engine that had been used to move the stock in and out. The thing was intimidating. I didn't have any manuals for it, and the last guys that ran it had probably died in the 1930s or 40s. I figured to use the rest of the limestone blocks as a base for the rail sleepers. I was planning ahead on how to get the materials ready for that phase. I knew I'd have to buy the rail screws, base plates, and tension blocks. And then there was the little problem of who was going to do the build-out. Sure wouldn't be me. I was told there was a steam tractor club a ways to the west. I looked them up, made a few phone calls, and drove out to or with a fistful of photographs of my steam engine. The group was made up of farmers, businessmen, factory workers, just about every job description you could think of. They told me to buy 8 tons of coal and where to buy it cheap. Then plans were made for a July road trip. I sure had the space for campers, and I could arrange for a 3-phase 440-volt line to the barn. Getting the big nuts off the firebox and the steam chest pretty much demanded having a big air impact wrench, which meant I needed a really big compressor. I had some work to do. I needed to set up a gnarly workbench and an overhead chain hoist for them to work with. It wasn't original equipment, but after the first load of wall stone was done that spring, I added a full-length porch to the office building. Then I had a builder come in and roof the place. I had to rush out to get the stove and pipe so that he'd know where to run the hole and flashing. The windows, doors, counter, and blackboard I managed on my own. Did you know there are companies that still make the big, clear glass light bulbs with a curly filament inside? They're great for historical recreations. That front porch was a great place to keep a big woodpile dry. I also hid my Weber kettle grill there. I was almost ready for the steam club's visit. I sat down with a beer and envisioned just how far I wanted to go with this. I had looked at the pictures of the operation and wrote down the particulars. The exhibit hall held a diesel crane car, 2 stack-sided gondolas, a coal-operated yard engine, and a coal tender. To use all this, I'd need a water tower, a coal bunker with a chute, about 2 miles of track, and 3 manual track switches laid out in a T-turnabout. Now we were talking real money. I sat back with my brew, wondering how to get some help with this. Government grants were drying up like sips in the desert. Then I got an idea that put a smile on my face. Maybe a local rail company or a timber company might like to get in on the deal for the advertising. I wouldn't know until I asked. The local timber companies, like Evergreen Lumber, wanted no part of the operation. But Dakota Pacific Rail? They must have been looking for a project for a while. They sent out a barge load of people and equipment to lay all the track and switches required. Then they wanted to build a second exhibit hall. I shrugged my shoulders and pointed their lawyers at the local development council, the bane of my existence. I guess that if you wear an expensive enough suit, you can get away with damn near anything. A new access road was cut and paved, leading directly to the highway. The exhibit hall went up and was filled with air-appropriate railroad equipment from back when steam was king. They donated to my fund for the classroom hall, but they didn't get involved beyond that. The steam team had that crane working within 2 months. The yard engine took a little longer. I was amazed, as the things probably hadn't been touched in most of a century. Took a lot of grease, though. I carefully watched them work and became both an oiler and an engineer. I learned what it took to keep them operational, and to actually operate the engine and the crane. With the crane operational, the dump got cleaned out a lot faster than I expected. The county had a place to start dumping rock and mud from their ditch clearing operations. I damn well billed them for the privilege, too. Since the dump site was bigger than a football field and about 70 feet deep, I figured it might take the county a while to fill it back in. I knew enough not to fall into it, but sooner or later we'd be getting tourists through the place. I used the excavator to build a solid timber fence around it. If I hadn't, my liability insurance would have eaten me alive. With easier access to the highway, I started examining the possibility of opening the place up as a private park. I thought about charging for day use, weekly passes, and yearly passes. I'd have to thin out part of the old timber storage yard to provide for a driving path and picnic sites. I'd also have to provide sanitation, and perhaps a couple of open-sided picnic shelters with grills and water taps. For winter use, I had to think harder. But I didn't see any reason why I couldn't make wall sections that could be fastened in place to convert them into heating shelters. I'd seen them in public campgrounds before, big stone fireplaces in rock-walled shelters. They looked handsome. I could even use the timber harvested while thinning out the area to build the shelters and wall segments. That sawmill was going to get some more exercise. Paving the road, putting in the toilets and septic vaults, and running the water lines were going to be my big expenses. I had to talk to the land use folks as well as the Parks and Recreation Department. I knew they had theoretical ratios of population versus developed and undeveloped recreational areas. Since I projected putting in sanitary facilities anyway, why not put in showers and open up primitive camping sites? Lord knows I could provide the firewood. I just had to get an amendment to sell the stuff. Sheep wagons and sheep herders' wagons weren't well known in the Midwest. Circus wagons were more common, descendants of the fancy gypsy Vardos. But nobody had seen a sheep herder's wagon this side of Wyoming. I had read about companies in Great Britain manufacturing them for a broad market. For some reason, Dorset rang a bell. Parks and Rec were all for a cooperative campground. They could help with the initial installation, but because of the way their budget was written, they couldn't provide employees to help run it. That was part of the reason my place was sold in the first place. I made arrangements with one of their botanists and a site architect to walk through the area and lay the place out. We marked the trees that would come down for the road, picnic areas, and campsites. We tried to leave the healthy pines, so they could produce a natural ground cover from fallen needles. Bands of bushes and other undergrowth were marked to be preserved to segregate the areas and provide privacy. We planned for 40 primitive campsites, 0 improved ones. I dug out some of the dumps overburden to make low berms, which could then be planted with heavy ground cover. That would be even better than simple brush lanes to block noise and provide line-of-sight privacy. We marked out where they would run. I added one to block off the garage building from the rest of the cleared area of the park. We scheduled the installations for later in the year, so I had a chance to drop the trees and pull the stumps. I had to be careful while snaking out those trees and blowing the stumps. With the name of the guys from Parks and Rec, I got big dump truck loads of rock and dross from Portage County and Wood County. They dropped it where the berms were to go. Using the bucket on the excavator, I did a bit of primitive dredging to pull some mixed silt and sand out of the river. Using some of the mixed sawdust and slash from the sawmill, along with pumped-in air, I force-dried the sludgy mess in a kiln. Once it was solid, I scraped it out with the excavator and used the tractor's bucket to lay it over the berms. I needed some decent soil in place to support plants. I went back to my arborist to find out what sorts of woody plants and low trees would thrive in the area. He gave me a list sorted by speed of growth. If I intermixed the fast growers with the slow growers, then by the time the early achievers died off, the slower-growing shrubs and trees would be well-rooted and ready to fill in the spaces. I mixed red alder with hedge maple, black cherry with thin-leaf alder, a more maple with mountain laurel. I planted the tops of most of the berms with Osage orange, so kids wouldn't cut through and make shortcut paths. They grow slowly, but when planted as hedges, they're damn near impenetrable. Then the berms were well watered and covered in straw. Cost me more than I originally thought it should. But then I realized I had over a mile of berms after I was done. I pressure washed all the equipment and garaged it for the winter. Since the space was heated, I'd be able to take my time doing maintenance on all 3 units well before freeze up. In early October, what looked like a construction battalion came through. They trenched and ran pipe, ran electrical lines, buried septic vaults, poured floors, installed street lights, dug out the road, filled it with heavy gravel, rolled it down, topped it with asphalt. They'd be back in the spring to put in the fixtures, finish the plumbing, and lay the fireplaces. They did something I didn't expect. In the wall behind the fireplaces, they installed galley kitchens. They left me with the specs for the wood they needed for the shelters. I got busy with the kilns, drying the wood, then hauled the trunks over to the sawmill to cut them to spec. I had it all dried, cut, and stacked by Christmas. All the extra lumber I cut down the middle of the logs, then chopped into 18-inch sections. Firewood. It still had to be split, but I could buy a splitter and hire someone to do the labor. I ran a spreadsheet to figure out my startup expenses and recurring costs. I even visited another campsite and talked over their operating expenses with them. A big one I didn't expect, the insurance. I expected the electric bill, sewage, and waste disposal. The labor was a given. I knew I'd have to buy a little ATV with a bed in the back and hire someone for minimum wage to do a daily pass around all the trash cans and rake up the overflow. Likewise, someone would have to watch the gate, take money, assign spots, and sell firewood. I asked for a copy of another campground's rule sheet, the one they printed on the back of their site map. I needed somewhere to start. I figured out who had the best rates for campground insurance. The state had a program for private campgrounds, so I proposed to the Parks and Wildlife Coordinator that in return for respecting state park permits, I'd like to buy into their insurance policy, sewage and solid waste removal contract. He had to kick it up to the state level, but I got an approval before spring. I had to incorporate the place as a non-profit operation before they could legally do anything. I didn't let my idea about sheep herder wagons drop. I took out quarter-page ads in the major newspapers of Wyoming, Montana, and northern Nevada, looking for reclaimable wagons with stoves. I found 9 available for $5,000 to $7,000 each. I didn't care what shape the running gear was in, as long as it supported the wagon's weight. Once in place, they weren't going anywhere. I had them trucked in and lined up next to the garage. I pulled them in one by one with the tractor. All of them needed new roofs, but that was nothing more than a piece of corrugated galvanized sheet steel. More work went into stripping down the walls, insulating them, and rebuilding the interiors. I painted each exterior a traditional dark green with yellow trim. To keep the fire risk down, I provided suspended kerosene lanterns, not stand-mounted ones. I cleared out a quarter-mile trail to another glade, with a parking lot for 10 vehicles at the front. I parked the wagons in a ring, far enough from the others so that if one caught fire, none of the others would catch. A communal fire pit with log seats went in the center. The wagons were set up on concrete blocks, so they wouldn't creak and rock. I figured that much distance from the main campground would give the area a bit of privacy, without building more berms. When the contractor and his team came back in the spring, I paid extra to have the road spur dug out, rocked in, and asphalted, as well as a communal shower building and vault toilet installed. He insisted on putting in a streetlight in the parking lot, which also illuminated the campground. After he left, I hired a local contractor to put a shield on that light to shade the campground. I liked the effect so much that I had all the streetlights shielded to illuminate only the minimum required. It was pretty much just the parking lots and bathhouses. There were lights inside the picnic shelters, mounted at the ridge poles, but they could be turned on and off. The breakers to the publicly accessible electrical outlets and the light switches were behind a locked door in each structure, inside the kitchen door. The contractor installed regulated heaters to keep the pipes in the kitchens from freezing in winter. His team installed lights, hoods, stainless steel tables, sinks, ranges, and ovens. I had to install refrigerators and provide trash cans. I had the electrical service for the park broken out into a separate meter, which took care of the not-for-profit regulations. I set the season for the park, May 1st to October 31st. That was 6 months of operation. I hired 2 guys to split all the firewood and pile it in face cords inside the garage. Then I contracted with an ice company to keep one of their freezers full. I bought a John Deere runabout to service the trash cans, haul cleaning supplies around to the shower buildings, and deliver ice and firewood. I worked with local college kids to man the gate, clean up, and handle small tasks. It was easy work compared to restaurants or fast food, so I never had a shortage of employees. I paid them as contractors with a 1099. After the first 3 months of operation, I found that I didn't have enough seating or bathrooms. The seating I fixed with logs I cut myself. Once I rented a post-hole drill for the tractor, I could plant seating logs everywhere. The contractor was available to build out 2 more bathroom facilities with running water and septic vaults, minus the showers. When I got the bill, I started looking for the platinum faucets. It wasn't cheap. With that many people running through the place, I started worrying about vandalism in the exhibit areas. I had visible high-definition cameras installed and a DVD recorder set up to capture footage for legal evidence. I wasn't making any money. In fact, I was operating at a loss. That winter, I started in on a letter-writing campaign to tap into any grants I could. I got a small grant from Dakota Pacific Rail for maintenance. I got another from the Smithsonian Foundation. My biggest benefactor was the National Park Service, which wrote up a package to cover the operation's shortfall for 10 years. That was great. It would cover my insurance, electricity, and labor costs. I could easily live on my pension and what I still had in the bank. I worked with a couple of local schools to see if anyone was interested in founding a STEAM club. I tied into a loose confederation of STEAM clubs all over northern Minnesota and Michigan. The big problem all of them faced was storage space. Steam engines are huge by definition. Also, if one was shut down for repair, it was likely to be for an extended period, which froze out that real estate. That usually compromised most of the club's workspace. I wondered how this was dealt with before the diesels took over. The answer was a roundhouse. The main features of a roundhouse were 1 feeder track to the external rail system, a turntable wide enough to cope with the longest car or engine, and a ring of work or storage bays surrounding the turntable, all on tracks. The traditional American roundhouse was just that. A monolithic, covered brick building, covered in soot and grime. The European model was cheaper to build and easier to expand. Once the turntable was installed on its specially designed round track, and the segments of a planetary gear were bolted together, a diesel engine was installed that was geared down to spin the thing precisely. Then the turntable was capped by a wood or stone platform, with 1 set of tracks laid across it, directly through the center line. The individual working stubs were left clear for the first 40 feet to work on the engines. Then they terminated inside garages, where the engines could be stored. Not every avenue had to be built at once. More could be added on demand. I wondered how much property would be required to build out such a facility. I started looking at the northern edge of my property, thinking about where a roundhouse could go. If I extended the top of the T-switch, I could run a rail line to the far north end of the property. That's when the no lumbering clause in my contract came back to bite me in the ass. I needed more land. I looked at the next property north. It was a 30-acre field that had been used to grow corn for so long that the soil was yellow-tan, not brown. I looked into buying it. The land was going for $8,000 an acre, which meant $250,000 that I couldn't afford. I talked to the farmer who owned it. We did a little horse trading. I sold him the excavator and he sold me the property, all for dramatically reduced prices to keep both our taxes down. We went with a written contract, specifying that he got all the spares and tools I had for the excavator, and in return, he'd strip out the rail line for me up to the property and set a gravel road to the new roundhouse site. First, though, I needed permission to run that rail line. Tom, the guy from Dakota Pacific Rail, had been tracking their investment in my place. He heard about the roundhouse project. His drinking buddy from CSX kept moaning about a warehouse full of old roundhouse hardware that they couldn't get rid of. Tom called Harry. Harry called his boss Dick. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry got excited to offload that white elephant. The CSX lawyer talked to the County Historical Commission about expanding the local rail museum. It was a go. The CSX construction teams got busy, building a berm, laying stone, setting sleepers, and laying track. They were nice enough to clean up and gravel in a parallel path, suitable for a modern tractor or a motorized cart. Then they poured a reinforced concrete bay for the turntable, laid in the track ring, set up the trucks, bolted together the planetary gear, installed the diesel engine and its engine house, built up the platform, and laid the turntable track. Then they laid track for 12 roundhouse bays and built garages for them. I'd never seen 4-foot-thick reinforced foundations before. It might have been overkill, but for damn sure, the tracks or turntable wouldn't shift from frost heave or long-term static load. It was a one-shot capital investment that eliminated a long-term cost from their operating expenses. They were happy. I was happy. And I had a lot of confused steam clubs wondering how the hell to get their rolling stock to Duluth. I pointed at the river, which was quite capable of taking river barges. Then I pointed at the railhead at the pier. Lights shone. Hoses were sung. Many contracts were signed. With the nonprofit group holding the property, arrangements were made to supply power to the garages for heat, light, and tools. All the clubs pitched in to dig out and fill the gravel road from the highway to the roundhouse. They also put in a parking lot, which put more money in the farmer's pocket. That made him happy, too. The majority of steam clubs bitched because they didn't work with steam locomotives. They worked with traction engines. Well, screw me running, there was plenty of property for a build-out. I turned them loose to build a huge pole barn. All they needed was heat, electricity, and fuel bunkers, whether for wood or coal. What was a disaster for a long-running nonprofit, the Alex Jordan Trust for House on the Rock, turned out to be a windfall for me. A gas line explosion destabilized a large portion of the structure, and the state condemned it. The trust scrambled for new homes for the displays. Circus World Museum took on many of the automated musical displays, and several entire exhibits went to the Museum of Science and Industry. However, nobody had the room for Gladiator, a massive traction engine and its associated automated steam calliope. I raised my virtual hand and waved it frantically. A lawyer for the trust came to examine the facilities and was happy with the new turntable build-out. We got an amazing bit of 19th century engineering and showmanship. The engine itself had been decommissioned for decades and had to be pressure tested. But we had capable people who had done it before. With the approval of Parks and Wildlife, we started advertising for a Midwest Rail and Steam Show to be held the third week of August, starting the next year. All the unused land reserved for steam operations was raked flat and seeded in grass. It would take almost a year to get the route mat established. We planned on having water buffalo tanks and pisons for exhibitors, the public, and campers, bales of hay and straw for seating, hay wagons as shuttle stops at the North End parking lot, the roundhouse installation, the picnic area, the train exhibit, the sawmill, and then back again. We charged $5 a day for admission, $20 to camp for the week. The week before the event, I had a farmer come through and harvest the grass. He cut and baled the fresh crop and traded us bales of straw and swamp grass for seeding. I got a local high school football team to help with parking for $20 a day and free admission. Several food vendors saw an opportunity forming. With the help of the county health department, we got half a dozen vendors in place, with contracts to clean up daily. I insisted that all vendors provide seating and tables, as there was nowhere else set up to eat. A local church group set up an enormous lemonade and hot pretzel stand. They made an absolute killing. We sold over 3,000 tickets in the first year. The timing of the affair was perfect. A steam show in northern Wisconsin near Eau Claire traditionally ran the second week of August. Not only did we not conflict, we drew some of the same exhibitors and many of the same visitors. Once we started advertising the campground, we definitely drew the summer vacation crowd. Where else could you park a camper for a week for $20? We filled the campground for the entire time and had daily reservations of the picnic shelters. Some groups split the shelters, one on one end, one on the other. The steam clubs chipped in to order tons of coal and a dumpster to haul away the ash and clinkers. We had 2 water buffalo tanks on hand to refill the engines, as they constantly lost water. Nobody died. Nobody fell into the dump pit. Nobody got into a serious fight. And we didn't have any grease fires. That's another huge section done. You want me to keep going? Locomotive fire versus Gazale. Continue ChatGPT Skazal. We did have about half a dozen ambulance calls, but with a crowd that large, it was expected. A steam show like this tended to draw an older audience, and late August in the northern Midwest was still hot as hell. Most of the calls were heat-related, but nobody was seriously hurt. After it all closed down, I had about a month's worth of work with a grader blade to level out the ground where the massive steam engines had rolled through. I laid out a performance ring and heavily spread cement powder over it, then gradually watered it in. Took a good week to get rid of all the trash, despite my precautions. Other than my ongoing work on the field, we were ready and geared up for the Labor Day celebration. We did better than breaking even. I distributed all but my labor and advertising expenses to the participating steam clubs to help cover their costs. It wasn't expected, but it sure as hell was appreciated. When school started up that fall, we had several field trips come through. They concentrated on the railroad exhibits and the sawmill, since there wasn't much to see at the roundhouse yet. They were allowed to walk around the traction engines, but they weren't as fascinating when they were cold and silent. Still, they were damn impressive just sitting there. Each engine had a placard fastened to its nose, describing date and location of construction, weight, horsepower. I fired up the coal-driven yard engine for the classes and ran it through the track switches. I had taken copious photographs of the steam team working over the yard engine. I had good shots of the guts of the firebox and the steam chest. I had them blown up and framed as exhibits in the shop area. We kept operating that way for several years without too many problems. At the 10-year mark, the National Park Service renewed our operational grant. It finally happened. I was getting those disability checks for a reason. I had lost so much control and capability in my legs that I was confined to a wheelchair most of the time. I could still pull myself up into my truck and drive using the power brakes and controls, but getting the wheelchair in and out of the truck bed was a real hassle. With almost 50 camping sites, the maintenance issues were constant and ongoing. I could still sit in the tractor and mow when needed. I took weekly tours of the place, noting issues, carpenter ants in the sheep herder wagons, mattress replacements, any vandalism. I bought a small, battery-powered runabout with large, all-season tires. It let me travel the fire lanes quietly. It was peaceful back there. The roads were chained off, so nobody went back there unless they walked. I didn't have established paths, but the deer trails went everywhere. That's when I started noticing garbage in the woods. I hired a team of 20 kids for a week to pick up trash. Then I put up signs. Dogs crap everywhere because they don't know any better. If you can read this, then you're not a dog. Don't throw your crap everywhere. You should know better. I got lambasted in the newspaper for putting a 4-letter word on a sign. I wrote a letter to the editor stating that since the park was private property and organized as a nonprofit, nobody had a single argument that I'd listen to, so they could sod off. I got a kick out of watching people take pictures of the signs while their buddies posed next to them grinning like it was a national monument. But you know what? The garbage in the woods disappeared. Some of the equipment was looking shabby. I had a team of painters come through and spiff up the place. The bare spots got fertilizer and reseeding. Gladiator, the massive traction engine, needed a full repaint. The paint job alone cost me over $4,000. That touched a nerve with the other traction engine owners. Their machines were starting to look shabby in comparison. About mid-July, they had a painting party for everything in the barn. Then they rolled out all the engines, covered up what needed covering, and pressure-washed over 10 years of coal smoke grime off the inside of the building. They had to replace all the light bulbs. But what a difference. A few years back, Barnum and Bailey's Circus World Museum in Baraboo arranged to have the park connected to a local live spur. Our little steam show grew by a factor of 3 when Circus World came to town. They didn't have animal acts or high-wire performers, but the Calliopes played from morning till night. Plenty of mimes, stilt walkers, jugglers, and clowns took the opportunity to perform for the crowd. I finally got my old mechanical knees replaced, and my hip joints as well. Thank God I kept my health insurance. I hired a manager to handle the day-to-day operation of the park. I'm fully retired now. My hair, what little remains, is solid white. I got rid of the old Trailmaster camper years ago. I bought a small prefab house, one designed for wheelchair access, and put it in its place. If you ever come to the big steam show someday, look for the old guy in the wheelchair. Come over and say hi. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of rebuilding history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. What part of this transformation amazed you the most? Let us know in the comments below.